From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports podcast.
The fastest growing entertainment phenomenon of this generation.
I, Prophet of Esports, joined today by my friend and co-host William Collis.
Yeah, we got the book of esports out. It's a big deal.
So everyone knows me as the Prophet and William as the Professor.
They may call me the Prophet, but in my life outside of the business of esports, I have worked on the investment side of the table for the better part of the last 2 decades. The single fastest growing area of gaming and esports is gambling. It's booming right now. You don't need to be a prophet like me to see that. However, as an investor, I've stayed away from gambling and betting companies because of the reputational risk and often shady nature of the companies involved. This was true until now. I've recently bought stock in a new public company called Esports Entertainment Group, or EEG, which is focused on esports and gambling. The big difference that changed my mind is that EEG is a public company, NASDAQ listed, and fully regulated, focused on esports betting. The regulatory and audit requirements of a public company are key in my mind to provide the needed transparency for players, bettors, and investors. I had an opportunity to host the CEO of EEG on this podcast a couple of months ago, and I was very impressed by his vision for the company. We've stayed in touch, and I'm delighted to announce that they've accepted to become a sponsor of the podcast. If you're a family office, institutional investor, or investor of any kind, really, Esports Entertainment Group, ticker symbol GAMBLE, GMBL, might be one of the best ways to get exposure to the esports betting space and gaming in general. Make sure to check them out at esportsentertainmentgroup.com. Having said that, I need to make sure to state that this is only my opinion. I'm not an investment advisor or selling stock in the company. Please make sure you do your own research and seek advice from a licensed professional if you're looking to invest in the field. From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports podcast. I am Paul Dewalibi. I'm joined today by my friend and co-host, William Collis. For those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome to the official podcast of esports. What we do here is we cover the most pressing gaming and esports topics and news of the week, but we look at all of it through a business and C-suite lens. We dissect, we analyze the business implications of everything happening in this industry. For our regular listeners, thank you guys for listening every week. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for telling your friends about the podcast. Thank you for leaving those 5-star ratings and reviews. We really appreciate it. This is how other people find the content here. This is how other people come to become fans of the business of esports. William, how are you doing this week?
I'm great, Paul. I'm great. Particularly because you and I actually played a video game together, right?
It was a long time coming.
It was a long time coming. We actually
squeezed in some Valorant over the weekend.
We did, and it wasn't a total disaster. Paul played.
It really depends how you define disaster, right? It's all in the definition of the word.
I like to. We won. That's what counts. Doesn't matter how we got there. Doesn't matter who carried who, right? What matters is the W.
True. No, we don't need to mention who carried who here.
No, I wouldn't bring that up at all.
I think our longtime listeners know. And on that note, guys, I mean, please go check out the Business of Esports shop. Buy a Team Profit shirt if you're the carry. Buy a Team Professor shirt if you're the anchor. And William, you know I love you. We had fun. And
we had a good time. We had a good time. Yeah.
We've got such a great topics this week. We've got something really unique this week for the podcast, which I will not even mention yet. But we also have an amazing guest who brings with him some of this uniqueness that I'm talking about. This week we've got Ben Paro, who's sales director for Esports and Gaming for North America at YouGov. Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, guys. I really appreciate it. Excited to be here. Love listening every week.
You are now in a very exclusive club, I will say. It's the 2-time guests on the podcast, reserved only, I think, for our best guests.
Wow. So when do I get a t-shirt?
When you go to the store and
I got it. I do have your book over here, William.
Oh my God, 5 stars. Amazing.
Unlike William, I will send you, Ben, a shirt or a hoodie or some socks or whatever you want for free. You don't.
That's true. I don't think I sent Ben that book. Apologies, Ben. Yeah. Thank you for the conversion on.
I'm here to support.
But I will say the socks are pretty awesome. We've had a lot of people who love the socks. More importantly, I was sorry, Ben, before he introduced you or give you the floor, I will say people who have been listening to the podcast have been tweeting about how some of the things we've talked about, they've acted on, and it has made them real money. So I don't know. I'm just putting it out there, but listening to this podcast may make you some real money. Ben, tell our listeners who maybe didn't hear your first episode, and actually you're in a new position now. Tell our listeners a little bit about you, your background, how you got into gaming, what you're doing now at YouGov, what you're focused on, what you're excited about, all those good things.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, so last time we did this, it was just a few months into COVID and our new life now. And I was speaking on behalf of a different company that was US focused research. And now I'm at YouGov, obviously, which is a global research firm. I'll get to that in a second. But my background was really in consumer insights. Started the media agency side, working with a lot of Fortune 500 brands and auto, retail, fashion, etc. Understanding consumer behaviors, media insights, and helping them action their strategy around to maximize their ROI. Right, that's the job of a media agency. But from there, I went over to the sales side, and now I'm selling research solutions. And so I joined YouGov about 3 months ago. And I was drawn here for a lot of different reasons. For one, YouGov is a very large international market research firm. Don't let the name mislead you. It does have Gov in there, and some people get thrown off by that. We did start in political polling in the UK. So across the seas, a lot, YouGov is a really like household name. People, expect to see it when it comes to just like political, it's just the biggest political pollster in Western Europe. But of course, we've crossed the pond now, and we have a huge consumer insights focus, and we have a long history going back, more than 10 years of working with gaming publishers, as well as with sports teams and leagues. We had through an acquisition a few years ago, we acquired a company called SMG Insights, which has now been rebranded as YouGov Sport. We specialize a lot in fan profiling and sponsorship impact studies and everything of the sort. And so we're now bringing all that to the world of gaming and esports. Before I started here, there's a woman, Nicole Pike, who you've probably come across. She led gaming and esports at Nielsen. And then for about 15 years, she worked there. And then she moved over to YouGov. And that was a really big signal to me that I needed to find out what was happening over here. And I've been fortunate enough to then actually get my resume onto her plate and landed the job, which I'm really stoked about. So that's kind of high level, kind of who we are. What we're bringing to the esports and gaming space specifically is scalable, reliable data on different cohorts of esports fans, but all in context to broader media and consumer trends. We operate an owned panel of 12 million people around the world who are active survey respondents. We have other ways to collect data from them that they offer to us beyond just self-response surveys. They also will provide some metrics onto their, let us see their digital behaviors, social feeds, streaming behaviors, OTT, etc. There's a lot of different ways that we kind of pulse kind of what's happening in the market. Our CEO likes to describe us as the Wikipedia of public opinion. Our goal at the end of the day is really to provide the means for consumers to give feedback to the brands that are trying to market to them. So that everybody kind of wins on both sides of that equation. So that's really high level of who we are. But What do you want? What else do you want to know?
Ben, I'm just curious. Like there are other players in the data space. Where does YouGov sort of see itself, or how do you compare to, some of the other players that are out there? Not worth mentioning, but like,
yeah,
where do you fit in that competitive landscape? What's unique sort of about the YouGov offering?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really unique about it is the size of the panel, and that is our panel. So we really put the consumer first, or in this case, the panel respondent. So we try to make it an engaging experience for them. We have really great retention rate of over like 75% of people who sign up to be a part of our panel and continue to fill in these questions month after month. And then beyond that, it's our ability to connect different data onto this kind of core massive data set that we're collecting. So I mentioned, we have 12 million people around the world. We have 3 million people in the US that are part of YouGov's panel. And within each of these markets that we represent, we have panels in 45 different countries around the world. We have, upwards of 200,000, 300,000 data points that we're tracking. And data is updated really frequently, like our brand information, and we'll go into some of this. We have some examples to share, over the next hour, but our brand information is updated daily. So it's like, there's basically a standardized brand tracker for thousands of brands, tracking key brand health metrics from we design these like a purchase funnel. And when I was doing brand trackers on the media agency side, it's exactly what we were doing over there for brands. So it's everything from people who are considerers and are interested in the brand to then actually being customers or former customers, and then do they recommend the brand, their satisfaction with the brand, etc. So if there's kind of two things that I could sum up what makes YouGov unique and a really powerful tool, it's the size of the panel and how quickly we get data back because of it. And I should also need to say that the data is really good, of course. So we were in a study by Pew Research, a research study on research studies. They found that we were consistently exceeded benchmarks for accuracy in understanding market trends.
Look, the really cool gift for our listeners this week, and the best part about having Ben on, I think, the second time, is you've come with some really interesting YouGov data, right? Like you've come with some slides, which if you're listening, I will make sure you guys understand what's on them. If you're watching on video, obviously I'm going to show them here. But what's really cool is I always love data that proves that I'm right. And it's nice that, because the prophet of esports, I talk a lot. I make a lot of correct prophecies. It's nice to finally have some data here to actually prove it. So, look, I want to just start with a couple of these slides here. I'm going to put them up. I will read them out, though. One of the findings here, so on this slide, you have essentially the percentage of two demographics, right? The percentage of all U.S. adults, and you have the percentage of just Gen Z and young millennials, so 18 to 34. And you're comparing between these two groups, how many of these identify as hardcore or mid-core gamers. And the beauty of this is, the takeaway here is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the 18 to 34-year-olds are twice as likely to self-identify as hardcore or mid-core gamers compared to like all U.S. adults. Like that, this age group really is very, very keen on gaming. I'm curious, maybe you can talk to sort of this side statistic here, which I think is also interesting and reinforces that.
Yeah, so the size statistic is as a longitudinal graph looking at year over year, going back to 2017, how many people in an unprompted question, the question being like, what are some of your top interests? And I think we just ask people to list out their top interest. Esports or gaming, I did the combination of both, is consistently increasing year over year for the past 4 years among US 18 to 34-year-olds.
Not surprising there.
Not surprising, but the trend continues, and it really just, again, to the point you said before, it validates what we know, right? Like, we know that gaming is popular. We know that young people are driving that popularity. Well, this just goes to show that this has been steadily increasing over time, and thus likely to not just disappear one day.
Yeah, I think this is
sorry, William, go ahead.
No, go for it, Paul. Go for it.
No, I was just going to say the cool subtlety here is that if you look at all adults, this graph says right now, as of December 2020 here, right?
Mhm.
13.3% of all adults, everyone in the US 18 plus, says gaming or esports are a top interest, right?
Mhm.
Whereas if you narrow in on the 18 to 34, that 13.3% goes up to 27.2%, right? Like
Yeah.
reinforcing this idea that gaming is young. It's I always talk about young, global, and sort of like wealthy, well-to-do, right? Like they have good disposable income. But
Yeah.
this
We'll get to that in the next slide or two.
this is really cool to see it, there.
I kind of think we're burying the lead a little bit here, though, Paul. And that, yes, you're right that a lot of this data is self-reinforcing, and it's nice to have evidence of what we already know, right? That like gaming is massively more popular amongst younger generations, and that esports is steadily increasing in popularity over time. But the crazy thing for me in this is close to 15% of U.S. adults listing esports as a top interest. That is all U.S. adults. That's why I wanted us to talk about this slide, because we all know, like, yes, the data bears that in the younger population, but like, I mean, what's the percentage of US adults who would list baseball in their top interest, right?
Sure.
It's got to be fairly comparable to this. So I sort of read this like, yes, partly it's nice to see data that reinforces what we already know, but I read this as like, wow, everybody likes esports, and that number's going up over time, right? Like it's increased. If I'm reading this correctly, there's been about a full percent increase in interest in esports between 19 and 20 amongst all the universe of all US adults. So that's like roughly a 10% increase in the popularity of that demographic. It was about 10 to 11% before. So that's pretty crazy that it's like this popular amongst everyone,
Yeah. And I think, projecting another year from now, it'll be curious to see kind of post-COVID if this, keeps ramping up or maybe it levels off. I think that's, something we'll obviously be keeping a close eye on.
I have a funny feeling that the trajectory it's on is not leveling off anytime soon.
Agreed.
In my opinion.
Not with a podcast this good, Paul. No chance.
Podcast this good. This one's an interesting because it's COVID related. It's how many people are playing, what percentage of people are playing more video games due to COVID, and what we're maybe explain, Ben, what we're seeing here specifically, because you have a lot of countries and some percentages here. Maybe just explain to our audience what the big takeaways are here.
Yeah, will do. So I guess the first thing is that we are looking at multiple countries here. In the last slide, we were focused on US, highlighting, of course, YouGov has panels all over the world. And this was part of a special study we did at the end of last year around gaming behavior specifically. And we see that in basically all countries. There's 5 countries here: Singapore, UK, US, Australia, and Germany. Those are just the 5 that I've reported here. But we see that a majority of 18 to 34-year-olds in 4 to 5 of those countries say that they are playing more video games due to COVID-19.
So more than 50% are playing more.
More than 50% are playing more among 18 to 34-year-olds. And in Germany, where it hasn't hit that 50% threshold, it's still 43% of them. And among all adults, in like Singapore, it's 47%, UK 43, US 40, Australia 44, and Germany 31.5. So just a lot more people playing more video games due to COVID. And then the next question here was, after COVID, do you think that gaming will be stronger and more relevant than ever? But we've subtracted people who say that gaming will be less relevant after COVID. And so the net on this is that in all these countries, except for Germany, we'll come there in a second, but in Singapore, UK, US, Australia, just about a quarter, if not a little more, of 18 to 34-year-olds agree that gaming will be stronger, more relevant than ever before, rather than those who feel will be less relevant. On Germany, so they're the only country here where they seem to feel that gaming will be less relevant after COVID. The sentiment here, and we spoke with some of our we have research teams in all the countries that we represent a panel in, and their interpretation of this was just kind of a German cynicism on a lot of things. So they tend to disagree more than agree with most things.
Interesting.
That was really the takeaway here.
And this is net, right? So this means like by a fairly large margin, just about in every country, especially in that 18 to 34 group, they think like post-COVID is not going to slow this train down.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is net.
William, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, the more interesting thing that I look at here again is less the youth demo. And again, for you guys who can't see the slide, this is, which is our podcast listeners, these countries are split into sort of the basically all adults and 18 plus demo, and then a sliced 18 to 34 demo. And obviously the 18 to 34 demo across the board is more bullish on gaming, right? The crazy thing is, in most countries, and we'll use the US as an example here, 40% of all adults are gaming more. Again, I like to look at the macro trend here, and I'm just like, that's incredible to me that it's not just like the 18-year-olds who are holding down the fort here and going back for more Call of Duty. This is like every single adult in the United States, 40% of them are playing more games. It speaks to just the fact that games you don't get numbers like this unless games are just a form of entertainment like movies or books. Like this graph that we're looking at here, you could tell me that would be the graph for Netflix consumption in the United States, and I would totally buy it, or globally, right? That's the magnitude of sort of the pan-adult growth we're seeing here in the YouGov numbers.
The interesting thing, Ben, is Ben could probably compare this to Netflix.
I could, yeah. Give me 20 minutes on my own. We could get those numbers for you.
Let's move on to this next one. This talks about disposable income, which again is one thing I've always. It's one of those pillars I think of why gaming succeeds in the long run. Is just there is quite a bit more. My belief has always been there's quite a bit more disposable income among gamers and esports fans. Ben, maybe you could again give us sort of the lay of the land on what are the takeaways here. And
this one,
what YouGov tells us about disposable income and esports fans.
Sure thing. And you guys have been so eloquent for painting a picture of what's on the screen for your podcast listeners. So I'll try to do the same. So we have kind of 5 charts here, and all of this is filtered by Americans 18 to 34. So we're just looking at 18 to 34-year-olds in the US. And then there's a US total 18 to 34 group, and then an all esports fans, a mid-hardcore gamer group, game stream viewers, and casual gamers. So of course, kind of our more gaming engaged would be that the esports fan group, mid-core gamers, and game stream viewers. And what we see is that those 3 cohorts compared to US 18 to 34 total and the casual gamer group have more disposable income. They over-index for having more than $500 to spend on a monthly basis. That's the particular question I picked here. To bring that home a little bit, among esports fans, 35% of them report having more than $500 to spend monthly versus 20% of casual gamers versus 23% of US 18 to 34 total.
Which is significant, right? You're talking about like more than 50%, right? Like literally more than 50% more people in that esports fan group have that level of disposable income. Like these are not like minor differences. Being
no,
an
that's
esports fan is, I could say from the data here, is really directly correlated with having more disposable income.
That's what the data says. Yep. It's certainly, I mean, I don't have the specific index on that on this slide here. Again, something else I could dig up out of the platform, but it would seem they're highly over indexed for having a greater amount of monthly disposable income among
William, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I have, 2 thoughts. One is this always ties back to the classic number that gets thrown around in esports, which is the under monetization per capita of esports fans compared to sports fans, right? And I think the really interesting here is, one common explanation for that is given is, because the fans are younger. Like a 45-year-old football fan has way more money to spend on jerseys than a 16-year-old gamer fan, right? And, this kind of puts the lie to that theory a little bit because it's saying, no, actually gamers have more money, right? Like, or they're relatively wealthier than other populations.
In that 18 to 34 group.
In that core 18 to 34 demographic. And so to me, it speaks to the growth potential in esports again, because, these are people who you're seeing it. We saw it in the other two data points. These are rabid fans that are very engaged, that are planning to play more and have money. It's natural to assume that their spending should be growing as well, and they have the power and the disposable income to spend. I think the other thing that's a little bit interesting here to some extent is the correlation between sort of basically, this is a little bit of an abuse of the data here, so I'm sure Ben will beat me up, but it's interesting that, like that basically as you advance up the spectrum of gaming from casual to mid-core to hardcore, you also seem to have more disposable income. So it sort of seems to say that gaming as a whole might index with, career success or motivation or something else. But it is interesting that like the more dedicated the gamers are, the more money they seem to have available. And again, you would probably think the opposite a priori. Yeah. Like if gaming is bad for you, all the myths that we've been taught from like, our childhoods, Paul and I's childhoods in gaming, right? Like, if gaming was a waste of time and all these, you'd expect the disposable income to go down the more you're playing, but it's the opposite. So I think it's pretty fascinating here.
Yeah. And a few things to add on that. I mean, I think, yes, you're drawing a correlation, which I think the data would actually does support if we dug deeper. But always want to pause people on taking too much away from a couple of slides. You should always dig deeper. But there are other trends that I didn't, share on this slide or any others for this podcast that show that, they're more likely to invest in stocks, more likely to have like a more senior type of title in their career and work more white collar versus blue collar jobs. The trend follows.
You guys, our listeners, you heard that from Ben and William, confirmed. Playing more games will make you richer.
Oh God!
It's not that, right? And this shouldn't be. We're not trying to cast aspersions on people who don't game, but it is interesting that like it does seem like gaming, is having positive effects on people's lives, right? Like it's presumptively, and again, we don't know about the causation here, right? But presumptively, this is. One possible interpretation of this data might be gaming is teaching skills, it's teaching discipline, it's teaching motivation, it's teaching commitment, and all those positive things that are then having knock-on effects in that gamer's life, right?
Yeah. Correlation, not causation, but definitely seems like a correlation.
Let's move on to the next one here. This is talking about, and there's a Venn diagram here, talking about the overlap of gaming versus streaming versus an esports fan. Ben, maybe you could just talk to some of the takeaways here.
Yeah, well, I think the most important takeaway is that these are three different things. And like there are three very different audiences. And I think, if you'll see this in Reddit chats or just talking with just a gamer on the street, they'll provide feedback that, brands don't really understand what esports is. They just lump us all together. They just want to get on the hype of aligning with, gaming. But esports is my passion, and it's a very different thing than just me being a gamer or I'm a true diehard gamer. I'm not a mobile gamer. Don't lump me in the same bucket. And I'm not someone playing Angry Birds on the way to work. That is a gamer though. So the important takeaway here from a very macro level is that as a marketer, you on either side, buy or sell side of the sponsorship or advertising process, need to be able to explain who your audience is from, being a gamer, from a gaming video content viewer, if it's someone who's just engaged with their favorite streamers on Twitch, there's not 100% overlap. There are people who just watch people stream games and aren't even playing games so much themselves. It's just 1% of them, but that population exists. From the data specifically, we're saying that 71% of Americans are a gamer on any platform. 25% are watching game video content, and 7% are esports fans. And there's a 47% overlap of people who fall into all three of those buckets. And then there's a correlation here of people who watch streaming content versus gamers. About 17% of that group do both those things versus 6% who are fall into all three.
Ben, William, sorry, I know you wanted to jump in, but
Yeah,
the number that stands out for me here, and again, for those who are listening, like this says that a quarter, and correct me if I'm wrong, a quarter of all U.S. adults watch or stream gaming content.
That's right.
That to me is a huge number. This is not just a few kids watching Minecraft videos on YouTube, right? This is a massive amount of content consumption. Like I wouldn't be surprised if that lined up with, or even was bigger than Netflix type of numbers. William, I don't know if you had a similar thought. Or...
I was going to say it's across all platforms, so got to keep that in mind. But go ahead.
So I'm always one to stretch the data, and I fear I'm misreading this a little bit. So Ben, you're going to have to correct me. But the thing that I find interesting about here is the overlap in the Venn diagram circles. So for the viewers who can't see this, the gamers, streaming, and esports fans are basically broken into overlapping concentric circles. And if I'm reading this correctly, it's basically essentially it's almost an escalation, right? So amongst basically to be watching streaming, you pretty much already have to be playing games. And then to be going to esports events, you pretty much have to already be actively consuming GVC, gaming video content, right? Like that is pretty incredible because first of all, one, I think many people have had hypotheses that streaming is somewhat divorced from game playing, right? And here, if I'm reading this correctly, it's like a 2% divergence in the circle. There's like 2% of the people streaming who are outside who don't play games. It's basically a non-existent demo. And similarly, for people who are esports fans but who don't watch streaming, and esports fans defined here as viewer attend esports events, just to be clear, right? It's like it's 1%, right? So basically, this is literally this is the equivalent of an affinity escalator on. You start by gaming, you get into streaming, and streaming moves you to esports fandom. And it's not either or at any stage, it's and. There's basically nobody goes from one to the other and drops out of the other group. I think that's absolutely fascinating because it really also highlights, I mean, just like, it's funny even to talk about my book, but one of the big hypotheses I have in the book was that how streaming became very important to the adoption of esports, right? Duh. But here it is with data, essentially, that streaming and consuming streaming is a necessary step in the evolution towards esports fandom.
And also interesting that there's not a single really, there's no esports fans that don't play. Like playing is a prerequisite. Basically.
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. Is like nobody is a casual fan of an esports team but doesn't play the games, which by the way is very different from real sports.
Yeah,
right.
Unique. Yeah.
Like I guarantee you, the vast majority of people watching the Super Bowl aren't active players of football.
So another kind of as we're talking about this further, another kind of concentric circle I'd like to see here are people who are watching content on Twitch or YouTube gaming that's not necessarily gaming video content. Like this, the way this question was asked, it's very specifically gaming video content. So, as far as it took a gamer it took streaming to help esports blow up, and gamers were the first kind of wave of audience on these streaming platforms like Twitch and others. But those platforms have expanded outside of just providing gaming content too. So I think that'd be another kind of interesting lens to add to this circle here.
Let's move on to the next one, guys. This one maybe was in some ways the one I was most excited about, just because there's so much interesting data here. But this is all about demographics, right? And comparing the demographics of all of esports versus specific esports versus traditional sports. And when I say demographic data, it's like what percentage are male or female, what percentage are in certain age groups, what percentage are Hispanic, Asian, Black, LGBTQ, like all of these kind of all this kind of demographic data, but really nicely broken out by esport or traditional sport. And maybe just some of the big takeaways here. Yeah, I know William and I have some thoughts in terms of what's really exciting in these numbers, but maybe just some of the big takeaways from your perspective.
Yeah. So I think, just start at a male-female split, right? So the data here, and this was updated January 3rd of 2021. So we can look at it again, but I'm sure it'll be pretty consistent. Says that 35% of esports fans are women. Some people might be surprised by that.
That's an interesting stat that I think most people don't think of sort of just naturally, right? Like I think people assume it's just so predominantly male. It's interesting that across all esports, that number is 35% female. I also wanted to just highlight before you sort of get deeper into the numbers here.
Yeah.
One of the cool things I think is that people tend to lump all traditional sports together. So everyone just kind of lumps all esports together. What's really fascinating about this data is there are really different, like there are big differences between the demographics of each esport.
Yeah, that is exactly, why a study like this was so important. Why, a product, data product like this was needed. And, Nicole and I, coming from two different companies, both identified this need. We were both working with, esports organizations or agencies that were looking to understand the esports landscape to see if it was a wise investment to put their brands forward in. But there wasn't the level of granularity in understanding esports and gaming that there was in traditional sports and media. So people were afraid to invest in it or to invest their clients' dollars behind it. So that was, a huge need and really the impetus for how we got here. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And so there, I just chose 4 game titles, but with the data is flexible that you could go into, specific regional events, or maybe you want to look at, people who are watching, DreamHack specifically, like you go into that kind of granularity. It can even drill down to specific esports teams, whether they're global or regional teams. So yeah, there's, tons of ways you can cut the data and slice and dice your different audience groups. Just chose a smattering here. But
like again, for our audience who's listening, there are some really interesting ones that stand out for me, right?
Yeah.
Like you look at all esports, it's this 65-35 male female split.
Mm-hmm.
If you drill down into CS:GO, that becomes 90-10, right? And this is probably where some of these preconceived notions come from, because CS:GO is 90% male and 10% female, but League of Legends has almost 30% female. So there's pretty large differences even across esports in terms of male and female viewership.
The thing
ahead, William.
Jumps out to me the most on this slide, and again, I'm trying to kind of stay with the big picture stuff, is again I'm going to harken off of Paul's comment with a specific example, but it's how every game behaves completely differently. And what stuns me on this slide is CS:GO and Call of Duty, right? Like you would expect those games, like they're both military shooters, right? They're arguably about as similar as games can get on this list, right? Like, or in general. Again, I'm exaggerating a little, but they're very similar games. Yet demographically, they behave entirely differently. And I'll give you one really interesting example here. 5% of CS:GO players are 45 or older. Okay, I get that. But close to 20%, like 16+% of Call of Duty players are 45 and older. That is a completely different demographic split. That's crazy. And what's interesting is it shows you that, so first of all, the games behave differently is interesting. The subtext I take away from that is the brand behind the game matters. I would say Call of Duty, arguably with its heritage, is basically a first, like a single player driven military shooter, has retained that branded audience of older players, right? So I think you're seeing that it's not necessarily even genres of game that are skewing certain ways. It's actually right down to the level of the brand itself, and the heritage in the brand makes these properties behave differently.
I mean, the other big takeaway, I totally agree, William, but the other big takeaway from this slide for me is looking at any of the esports data versus the NFL. When you look at the number of fans 45 plus, or viewers 45 plus,
I was going to point that out too.
The NFL's at 53%. So 53% of NFL viewers are 45 plus, and on the esports side, like the highest is Call of Duty here at 16%, right? And you look maybe more frightening for the NFL is 18 to 24, only 11% of NFL fans are 18 to 24. Like this does not bode well for traditional sports future.
Let me before I get my wrist slapped from the NFL or one of our account managers who works with them on a day-to-day basis. Let me just caveat here and say all this is filtered by top 2 box. So this does not include like NFL, like people who are light NFL fans, and so I think that might round out some of these figures a little bit. Likewise, it doesn't include people who are light League of Legends or CSGO fans, because we've found as we've mulled over the data and we get fresh data every week, we're constantly poking around in it, that there are a lot of people who are like esports curious, and so they might say that they're light esports interested, but then when you go a little bit deeper into kind of the titles they say they watch, you kind of like step back and you ask yourself, I'm not sure that they're a true research esports fan. So just like to point that out, and I'm sure that more than 11% of people who watch the NFL are 18 to 24.
But in some sense, though, sort of what you said is actually worse because it's top 2 box, right?
Top 2 box.
It doesn't surprise me. Like I love watching football games from time to time. Like I think most Americans will enjoy. Like we just had the Super Bowl. Like it's fun to watch. But it's different between being an occasional experience that is consumed and generally in your interest set, particularly for a property as ubiquitous as the NFL, and being a top 2 box affinity. And what's crazy to me is all the top 2 box affinity for the NFL is 45 plus, and it drops off really fast. Like it's not like 45 and then 35 and the 35 to 44. It goes from 53% top 2 box to 18%. So 53% of the NFL's fans or the NFL's top 2 box fans are 45 plus. The next closest demo is 35 to 44 at 18%. That starts to look like a generation gap, very honestly, right?
It does confirm, a lot of what we talk about, though, which is the demographics are on esports side, right? Like fundamentally, there's an attention shift that's happening that is when you look at data like this, undeniable, and B, sort of inevitable, right? Like it's happening, and no one really has any control over this, but the data's there, right? It's in your face.
I mean, I always look at this and, numbers like this, and I always think to myself, like, if this were a business school class, take like the personal thing out of this. Imagine this is ice cream consumption versus chocolate bar consumption, right? And you would look at these numbers. Like, I know if we were in a strategy class in business school, we'd say, oh, that ice cream company is in trouble. All the young kids like chocolate bars, like it's just, and it's an odd remark to make maybe, but it really highlights, like, I know that there's a lot of personal emotion, built up in this because potentially many listeners of this podcast love video games and like rah, but at the same time, even if you turn it to a neutral example with these same numbers, like the implication is very clear, right?
This one's kind of cool because it just shows some of the depth of the data that, is always interesting to talk about, Ben, but maybe you can describe what this is specifically. And I'll just give sort of the headline here. This is League of Legends esports fans in the US specifically, and sort of a breakdown of all their demographics. Sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, so where on the last slide we had a table that had basic demographics across the different leagues and compared to NFL and game stream viewers. Now we're just going, the next layer deeper on League of Legends fans specifically. So included here are like their highest level of education completed, their current employment status, relationship status, what their household makeup looks like, their parental status, and the types of areas they live in. With the YouGov data, and I'll go into the data points in a second, but this is still pretty basic level for what's available in the data set, but one step deeper than what we had on the last slide. So what stands out to me? I mean, let's start on the right, and maybe we'll do this Hebrew. We'll go to the left. Like relationship status. A quarter of League of Legends fans in the U.S. are married. Half of them.
A third.
Oh, sorry, a third. Yeah, I misspoke. A third of them are married. Another third of them are single. About half of them have never been married. When we look at kind of the household makeup, a third of them are still living with their parents. An equal amount are living with a spouse or a partner. And then 10% are living alone, 10% are living with a friend or roommate. And about half of them are parents or guardians, which is, I think, really interesting. And I think there's a perception, and we kind of talked about this early on, that it's really just single guys who are early in their life stages and haven't, whatever. You ramble on and on about what that implies, but that's not the case. We've clearly kind of aged into next life stages, parenthood being one of them.
Ben, that stat is like so interesting to me, right? Because I would love to see how if this is somewhat inherent across all MOBAs as a genre. Right, because I hear this to me is like the William example, which is, he's got 2 kids, right? He's got a full-time job. MOBAs are great for like experiences that are encapsulated and have a finish and an end. And if all you want to do is play 45 minutes, it's kind of the perfect experience, right? You're not committing to anything longer or a campaign that you get sucked into. And the fact that 54% of League of Legends fans are parents, this seems very high to me. And William, I'm curious if you think
it's a really good point, because you and I were talking about this before the podcast, right? About I have gotten into MOBAs more in part because of having children, because it's such a bounded period of time. Like, I will hesitate to play immersive single player games because I know I won't be satisfied in a 45-minute window. Like, that's like the opening cutscene, some inventory management, and like maybe the start of a side quest, right. like it's not going to happen. But I know in the MOBA genre, I can, if I have an hour to commit, I can get a good game in with some, witty banter with my buddies. And maybe if I'm lucky and I'm willing to roll the dice on an extra 15 minutes, I can fit in too, right? So it is interesting how this, in some sense, does sort of describe like a very personal thing I've noticed, which is how my gaming habits have shifted based on genre over time, is matching this. But yeah, it's really curious.
That's another great takeaway. I mean, so again, we're focused on League of Legends esports fans here, but I love that hypothesis about looking at the games people play, like not going beyond the esports they follow, but the games people play at the title level. Like, do they over-index based on kind of their life stage, based on kind of the format of the game? And I think, I'll confirm. We'll get back to you on that one. That's great.
Okay, let's talk. I just want to finish up on a couple here before we get into at least one news topic, because we are running out of time. This one was a really cool one because it's a graph showing like impression, like feeling, sentiment around the MasterCard brand specifically. And it's showing MasterCard's sponsorship of League of Legends, right, Ben? And how that sponsorship has led to an increase in the fans' impression or feelings around the MasterCard brand. Ben, maybe you can talk to it a bit better than I just did, but
yeah, no, I mean, you did a good job. So there's 2 lines here on this graph, and it's tracking from August of 2019 to June of 2020. And the first line is fairly flat, and it's like an orange color, and that represents total U.S. population 18 plus. And so what we're tracking here is net impression of MasterCard. So this is net impression. Impression is one of the 16 standardized brand health metrics that we're tracking for all these brands in our system. The data is updated daily. So pretty consistent throughout the year. Impression of MasterCard was flat for total US. Now, the other line in this chart is a bit more shape to it, and it's a dark line. And this represents US League of Legends esports fans. And so first thing, consistently across the board, it's above the impression of MasterCard among US total. And we isolated the 2019 League of Legends Worlds as a time frame on the graph. And we see that, after and MasterCard, of course, was a premier AAA sponsor of Worlds that year, still is. And we see that following the World's Championship, impression of MasterCard not only went up during the period of the event, but continued to increase over the lifespan of both the 2020 LCS Spring Split and then peaked up at the 2020 LCS Spring Split playoffs. So it just shows kind of the full life cycle and success that this sponsorship had for MasterCard in partnering with the League of Legends tournament.
I mean, guys, correct me, like maybe you see it differently, but my takeaway here is even non-endemic brands, and you know how much I hate endemic versus non-endemic, but even a non-endemic brand like MasterCard, right? Sponsoring League of Legends Worlds here, like, again, significant difference in feeling between that and the general US population. Like, the League of Legends fans really responded to the sponsorship in a massively positive way. William, I don't know if you came to the same conclusion on this one, or
yeah, I do. The thing I would point out, again, I'm always trying to read, like a little, like whether the thing I'd point out this is actually the time lag for the affinity to build, because if I'm reading this chart correctly, MasterCard's big activation around 2019 Worlds is October and November of 2019, right? And yeah, they do see a brand spike there to some extent, but it's not really significant. It's basically moving MasterCard back to a historical high watermark of affinity. It's not really growing it. But what MasterCard sees is after that LOL Worlds launch, the brand continues to steadily increase and compound month over month until it actually reaches its high watermark almost a year later. Right. And so I think this, something you'll hear people in esports say is it has to be a sustained engagement. The fans, it takes time for the brand, halo effect to kick in. And I think this is really nice evidence of that. Is the biggest benefit of the major activation was actually felt not during the major activation, but in the 12 months trailing it, which I think is a really interesting and curious piece of how esports fans behave. I think it also is important for sponsors, who are maybe looking to dip their toes into the water, and maybe thinking of sponsoring their own tournaments or, the LCS itself or whoever, be careful. The short-term stuff, it might not be enough time to reap the types of effects like MasterCard, which presumably they're very happy with because they're still LCS sponsors, is able to generate by doing a much longer-term engagement.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Sorry, Paul, but I was going to say kudos to the Riot team for making this, a big picture initiative. And of course, who knows how those conversations went. If MasterCard just, came in and said, all right, we want to sponsor one tournament. And, I'm sure Riot was like, well, that's not really going to give you the return you're looking for. It's got to be like a true partnership. And obviously MasterCard leading into that, and they are reaping the rewards, as you said. So, you're spot on. It's got to be an authentic engagement, right? Like it's got to, MasterCard has shown, and I think they've done an incredible job, not just plastering the brand around LCS tournaments, but bringing value back to the community and meeting them where they want to be met.
I mean, there's a great business lesson here in general, which is like one transaction from a sponsorship perspective almost never works, right? I always come back to my own rule, the rule of 7, right? People have to hear a message 7 times before they internalize it. And this is why advertising works if you do it over a long period of time and maintain consistent messaging and all those good things. Like clearly it's working here, but again, I come back to the power of esports in terms of raising the profile of brands, and we've seen gamers have disposable income.
I was going to say MasterCard, they knew they wanted to get in front of this audience because they want to be the card that this audience is charging all their things to.
That's it, guys. Before we get to this last slide, I just want to say 2 things. The single fastest growing area of gaming and esports is gambling right now. It's booming. As an investor, I've stayed away from it because of the reputational risk. Everyone knows that. The one exception, Esports Entertainment Group, EEG. Incredible company focused on esports and gambling. It's a public company, NASDAQ listed, fully regulated. We've had the CEO on the podcast. We've had some of their people on the podcast. So if you're a family office, institutional investor of any kind, I highly recommend checking them out. esportsentertainmentgroup.com, ticker symbol GMBL. They're doing amazing things in the space. Having said that, small disclaimer, this is just my opinion. I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not selling stock in the company. Do your own research. Seek advice from a licensed professional if you're looking to invest in the field. Guys, let's move on to the very last slide here, which I think is really cool because this is what I was getting to. This proves the prophet was right here, and that is That is the Apple Fortnite dispute. Okay. And Ben, I love that you brought this one. I don't know how you even thought to bring this one, but it's like truly great.
I'm a listener.
Thinking alike here. But the beauty of this slide, it's a timeline. There's sort of a bar where Apple banned Fortnite from iOS, right? And then we see from that point on what the brand impression was for Fortnite, for Epic Games, and for Apple. And maybe you can tell our listeners what really happened here from a brand impression standpoint.
Sure. Well, let's just start with Apple. Not affected. They really, there's not an impact at all. In fact, if anything, it looks like it increased a little bit following that and then normalized again. Epic Games also not super impacted as a brand. There was some dip, but they recovered. But the Fortnite brand did suffer pretty significantly. And so it's a pretty...
Well, Ben, you're really underselling this. I think this graph is way more, not to cut, but I think this graph is like way more dramatic than that because...
All right, lay it on. Paint the picture.
With my eyes, what I see is look, Apple, probably one of the most loved brands, right, in America, arguably, right? Certainly but at the beginning of this graph, before the Apple Fortnite lawsuit, Fortnite is tracking on a net brand impression basis to be similar to Apple. It's at 50 net brand impression score versus Apple's 60, right? So very, very favorable impression. And in fact, funnily enough, it's almost suspicious, but actually at the time of the announcement, they have almost the exact same brand score, which is like a 55 here, net brand impression score at the time of the immediately after that. Yeah, you're right. Apple basically totally unaffected, goes up a little bit. Fortnite starts to tank and it falls all the way from a 50 net brand impression score down to negative 15. It's going in 6 days. It's like going off a cliff. That's literally a business being turned from Apple-like levels of adoration to net negative consumer sentiment about it. That is pretty radical in a 6 day period. That's insane. And I think it goes to what Paul was saying and what ended up being felt in market, which is consumers perceive this as, hey, I used to be able to get Fortnite on my phone. I can't get it anymore. I know Fortnite started it. Fortnite, bring it back. And it also shows that the consumers don't halo it over to Epic. They think this is the game. The game's not there. I'm mad at the game. It's interesting to show how direct the perception loop is in consumers' minds.
That was much better and painted a much clearer picture than my ill attempt. Thank you, Will.
This is also why, I don't know if Apple's a YouGov customer, Ben, but if anyone at Apple was looking at this, right, to me, this gives me ammunition internally to say, well, let's keep fighting this. This is a no lose for us, right? Our customers still think we're great. Fortnite's the only loser here, right? And so it's interesting because the data can be really actionable too, right? It's not just to prove that, we were right or whatever, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, if we're doing our job correctly, the data should be actionable. We should be asking the right questions so that it can be so it's useful. For sure.
This was so cool. I just want to we got to do at least one news story this week. So hang on, I'm gonna bring this up here. We've got so many good news stories this week. So if you're listening to this, guys, if you want to get to all the stuff that didn't make it into the podcast, make sure to watch the live stream. We're going to get to a bunch of stuff. We're going to get to a lot of public company reporting, earnings talks, and who are the winners, who are the losers. I want to talk about this one. This one's sort of near and dear to my heart a little bit. I'm going to bring this up here. I'm going to share my screen. But this article is from jalopnik.com. And the headline here is esports racer Jimmy Broadbent is moving up to real life race cars. Now, for those of you who don't know, Jimmy Broadbent, a very, very well-known sim racer, streamer, has a really cool sim rig that he streams from. But basically, he's now been recruited to race in what's called Britcar. It's a British endurance racing series. And he's going to be driving a real life sports car, not the sim car that he usually does. I love this story because there's sort of like overlap here between what's going on in the esports world and what's going on in the traditional sports world. And I'm curious what you guys think about this overlap. Is this a sort of a momentous occasion? Is this a milestone, or is this just something cool to talk about?
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I'm terrible at racing games, and so don't judge me on my driving abilities based on how many times I hit the wall in Gran Turismo. But I think it's a really interesting crossover. I think it is also, it's unique to racing games, right? Like, you're not going to have people who are great at NBA 2K suddenly get on the court and, dunk on LeBron. Like, it's a different type of thing, but you have the home rigs, and I think it's a testament to the technology in those sim racing rigs. I mean, that's pretty cool. And there's different implications of kind of what other types of sim rigs could we create.
Ben, I just want to push on this, William, before you jump in. I've often said that esports have the capacity to essentially replace traditional sports, right? Like in a holodeck or Ready Player One kind of future, we may end up playing everything just in virtual worlds anyways, because there's less risk, less injury, all those good things. In some ways, we're seeing a reverse course here, though, right? Like, this is someone going from the safe virtual world of racing to the much more dangerous real world. Is this going backwards in some way from an industry perspective, or you don't see it that way? This is good for both esports and traditional sports.
I think it's a win-win for everyone. We're not in that holodeck future yet, so I don't think it's like a step back and towards the ice age. Like, this is still very relevant, and if anything, I think it's still a step forward for gaming in general. I think it's good press for everyone. I think racing's a really interesting category that I don't know enough about, right? Like, as a sport and fans of it, it's got a bit of a split demographic across different racing events and leagues. So I think any crossover is great for the space, and it's really it's an awesome example, and good for him.
William?
Yeah, I wish I had something fundamentally insightful to add, but this is just a really nice feel-good story to end on, and I'm glad we got to close off on it, because it highlights the fact that, look, gaming can build real transferable skills. And in this case, you're seeing it very directly. This is somebody who's now taking a success in a virtual car and hopefully turning it into a success in a real car. And I think it highlights, as all the things we've talked about on the podcast as trends, as VR, as fidelity, as immersion, as all of the technology continues to enhance and make gaming more immersive and all-encompassing, we're going to be seeing more and more of these stories, not less. Who knows? Maybe there'll be the day where it's, CEO of a company, or hedge fund CEO steps up from his success playing stock trader on Steam, or like incredible World of Warcraft auction house luminary tapped to run,
a hedge fund.
Yeah. Hedge fund. Yeah. I mean, it's quite serious. Like, all joking aside, I think it really does. It shows there's value in gaming. You develop real skills, and here's somebody who's, a physical embodiment of that.
I'd be curious to know how many people have become architects because of the houses they built in Sims.
It's true.
Great point, actually. No, I'm not kidding. Like, it's a great point. Many people's interest in architecture could have started from optimizing their sim home.
Right.
Well, thanks to the YouGov data, we know at the very least that playing games makes you wealthier. So, I mean, look, it doesn't matter what career path you choose. Guys, Ben, thank you so much for being on the show. This was awesome.
It was a lot of fun.
It was truly, I think, an original episode. We got to present so much really cool data. So thank you. Where can people find you, Ben?
You can find me on LinkedIn. My name's only 7 letters, Ben Paro. It's Paro. You can also email me at ben.paro@yougov.com. Happy to answer any questions, share this data with you, and dive into all the data we have as it relates to the questions you want to answer. And guys, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity. I love chatting with you, and I'm glad to see you're all both doing well out there, and can't wait for us to get together in person one of these days.
I have a sneaking suspicion you're going to make the 3 times club at some point. And so thank you, Ben. William, thank you as always. And for you guys listening, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for leaving those 5-star ratings and reviews. If you haven't, please do so. Tell your friends about the podcast. Go buy William's book, The Book of Esports. Go buy some Business of Esports merch. Any way you support us, it's really appreciated. Also, don't forget, follow us on Instagram, follow us on TikTok. William's doing all kinds of crazy dances on TikTok at Busy Sports. And make sure, tune into our live stream every Wednesday evening, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's a lot of fun. We cover all the topics that don't make it into the podcast. These days, the guests have been so good that we haven't been fitting a lot of topics into the podcast. So we get to cover them on the live stream, which is great. And you get to interact with us live. It's so much fun. And check out my minutes also. Every Monday or Tuesday, I put them out. It's the 3 top stories of the week with my sort of commentary on it. On that note, guys, thank you so much. The podcast drops on Thursdays, and we will see you guys next week.